They never told you the truth of what happened to her. They couldn't, because if they did, you would begin to see the pattern, the one written in blood across the forgotten corners of America. The name they whispered was Eliza Whitlow, married at 13, pregnant before her body even knew how to bear the weight of life. But Eliza's story is not just tragedy, it is evidence of a machine older than this nation, one that consumes innocence and feeds on silence. What you're about to hear is not just history, it is initiation. The winter of 1802 in rural Virginia was bitter, the kind of cold that burns through the marrow and leaves the weak clinging to whatever promise of warmth they can find. In the village of Tannersfield, a girl named Eliza Whitlow became that promise, bright-haired, sharp-eyed, carrying the quiet grace of someone marked long before she could understand why. She was 13 years old the day her fate was sealed, but the strings had been pulled long before. The official records tell a sanitized tale, a marriage to a man nearly twice her age, sanctioned by the church, blessed by neighbors, and dismissed as common practice for the frontier. But buried beneath those polite entries are testimonies sealed away for 2 centuries that hint at something else. Not love, not chance, but a transaction. Her husband, Jonathan Cray, was no ordinary farmer. He appeared in the county only months before the marriage, with wealth far greater than his supposed trade could ever justify. He was charming, educated, carrying with him books and silverware that frontier men simply did not possess. And he chose Eliza, not by accident, not by affection, but by design. Because Eliza carried something rare: literacy, intelligence, the spark of thought too dangerous for the world she was born into. She had been taught to write by her mother, and in her small hand, chapeau, it recorded everything. Every word, every suspicion, every secret she was never meant to hold. What no one tells you is that Eliza's marriage was not just a bond between man and girl. It was a cage, constructed to silence her, to harness her usefulness, and to erase her voice before it grew too loud. And yet, her voice survived, in the form of a diary buried beneath floorboards, recovered in 1901, and quickly hidden again. A diary that reveals not only the cruelty of one man, but the architecture of something far more sinister. This is not a love story. It is a ledger of corruption, ritual, and control. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. They said the Whitlow marriage was blessed in a small wooden chapel that no longer exists, its timbers long since rotted into the soil, but the accounts of that day do not match. The church ledger lists only 3 witnesses, though by law there should have been 6. The preacher recorded as officiating the ceremony had died 2 months earlier, something that the county clerk's office conveniently overlooked. What does that tell you? It tells you this was not a marriage sanctified by God, nor by community custom. It was a ritual, an arrangement orchestrated outside the visible laws of man. A paper marriage to legitimize something darker. Eliza was handed over in silence. Her diary, however, paints the scene with chilling clarity. She wrote of the candlelight, of men in black coats whose faces she had never seen before, and of her own mother's trembling hands as she signed the final mark of consent. That trembling is important, because it was not just fear of poverty or the shame of refusing an eligible suitor. It was fear of something else, something she could not name aloud. The Whitlow girl was 13, but her own words betray a mind far older than her years. "They said I was chosen," she wrote. "Not for my beauty, not for my virtue, but because I see, because I remember, because I do not forget." Who told her that, and what did she mean? Her husband, Jonathan Cray, wasted no time. Within weeks the girl was with child. But here's where the narrative bends into shadows. The pregnancy itself was not celebrated by the community. No congratulations were recorded, no neighbors brought gifts or blessings, no notes appear in the local letters of the time. It is as if the child did not exist, except in Eliza's diary, where she describes her growing body with a mix of terror and awe, as though the life inside her was not entirely her own. And then, midway through her diary, the language shifts. She stops writing about her husband's kindness and provision. She begins noting his absences, long stretches of nights where he vanished into the forested hills. He always returned with supplies, with money, with strange trinkets of value that could not have been earned honestly. One night, she wrote a single sentence that scholars have tried to explain away for more than a century. The baby kicks hardest when he returns, as though it knows what he has done. Think about that. A child not yet born, responding to the footsteps of a man drenched in something darker than blood. This was no ordinary marriage. It was the opening move in a game older than Eliza, older than Virginia, older even than the frontier itself. The world remembers Jonathan Cray as a farmer. That's how his name appears in the tax rolls: landowner, livestock, tools of tilling. But Eliza's diary tells another story, one that cracks the mask he wore so carefully. He was not a farmer. He was an extractor, a collector, a man whose hands were rarely dirtied by soil, but often by something far more valuable. Eliza describes the nights when he vanished into the wilderness. She wrote of the faint glow of torches through the trees, of voices carried on the wind, men's voices, low, deliberate, chanting words she did not recognize. She was forbidden to leave the cabin, forbidden even to stand near the windows after dark. Yet she did what all the truly awake must do. She observed, she remembered, she recorded. On the night of March 14, 1803, she wrote, "They came in a line, 5 of them, each carrying sacks heavy enough to bow their shoulders. He told me not to ask, but when I placed my hand upon the wood of the floor, it trembled with every step they took. The earth itself seemed to recoil." The next morning Jonathan returned with silver, not coins, but household goods, candlesticks, a polished mirror that looked far too fine for frontier families. He told Eliza he had traded with passing settlers, that they had left him these things in gratitude. But she knew. She wrote, "No family leaves their mirror behind, nor their mother's wedding band, nor the books that bore their names. He is lying. He lies with every word, but he cannot lie to the silence of what he brings back." Do you understand what this means? Families were vanishing on the trail. And the possessions Jonathan brought home were not spoils of trade. They were trophies, signs of removal, signs of cleansing. And yet Eliza noticed something even darker. Not everything brought back was material. She describes a locked chest, one she was forbidden to touch, den beneath the floorboards of the cabin. She never saw what it contained, but she felt it. She wrote, "When I slept above the place where the chest lay, my dreams filled with fire. I saw faces I had never known, mouths open, screaming with no sound. And when I woke, the baby inside me thrashed as though it had heard them too." Her husband was no mere criminal. He was part of a design, a ritual extraction of families whose absence was quietly erased from the records. And Eliza, 13 years old, pregnant, silenced, had become the unwilling witness. But here is the truth you were never meant to know. She was not just a witness. She was the ledger, the living record. And her words, hidden away for more than a century, prove that what happened in that cabin was not isolated. It was systemic, a pattern, a mechanism of disappearance that stretched far beyond Virginia. By the spring of 1803, Eliza's pregnancy had advanced, and her diary shifts into a strange dual voice, half the thoughts of a child forced into adulthood, half the confessions of a woman who had seen too much. What unsettled the later historians most was not her mention of Jonathan's secret dealings, but the way she described her unborn child. At first her words read like those of any young mother, nervous excitement, curiosity, even tenderness. She wrote about how the baby kicked when she read aloud, how it seemed to stir when the wind rattled the shutters, how she dreamed of holding it against her chest. But the entries began to darken. "The child does not feel like mine," she wrote one night. "It listens when he enters the room. It goes still, as though waiting. And when he touches me, it flutters so violently I feel it may tear itself from me." Can you imagine that? A girl of 13 describing not just the growth of life inside her, but the way that life seemed tied to the presence of a man steeped in blood and secrets. Her words suggest something unspoken, that Jonathan did not just want a wife, he wanted a vessel, a body to bear a child forged not in innocence, but in design. And here, the diary fragments into something more disturbing. She begins sketching symbols in the margins, triangles, circles intersected with crosses, lines arranged in repeating sequences. Historians dismiss these as idle doodles of a restless mind, but they match carvings found on trees near old frontier trails where families disappeared. Coincidence? Or proof that Eliza was seeing and remembering things no girl her age should ever have known? She wrote of nightmares where her belly split open, and from it emerged not a baby, but faces, dozens of them, the faces of families who had vanished. And in one chilling entry she confessed, "He tells me the child is not mine, nor his, but theirs. That I am only the soil, and the soil does not question the seed." Think carefully about those words. Soil, seed. These are not just metaphors of farming. They are metaphors of ritual, of breeding not for love, but for purpose. Eliza was beginning to understand the truth. Her body had been conscripted into a system of control. Her child was not simply her own flesh and blood. It was intended to be something else, a continuation, a claim. And this realization is where the descent truly begins. Because once she understood she was not a bride, not a mother, but a vessel, her writings shift from fear into rebellion. Quiet rebellion, yes, but rebellion nonetheless. She began to hide things, to write in codes, to record not just his words but his slips, his secrets. She was not just surviving, she was preparing. By midsummer, the diary no longer reads like the ramblings of a frightened girl, it reads like the work of a spy trapped within her own home. Eliza, still only 13, had begun to write in symbols, what looked like scattered doodles at first, flowers, stars, broken lines, revealed a hidden pattern once scholars compared them against cipher texts used in the early colonies. Eliza was documenting something far more dangerous than nightmares. She was tracking names, initials, and coded places. She wrote of men who came to the cabin at night, not for drinking or trading, but for the circle. She described how Jonathan would set a table with candles and maps, and how the men, always older, always landowners, spoke in a language she barely understood, but she caught fragments. Property must be sealed. The daughters must not speak. Blood binds more tightly than law. Her entries suggest these were not random gatherings, but part of a network stretching across the frontier. Families that appeared prosperous, respectable, even godly by day were bound together by something unspeakable at night. And Eliza, still a child, was forced to sit in the corner while her husband played host. She wasn't allowed to speak, but she listened, and she remembered. One passage later decoded by historians chills the blood. They place marks on the doors of homes. I have seen them. When a girl comes of age, the mark is cut deeper. When she disappears, the mark is rubbed away with ash. Do you see it? This wasn't a single man's cruelty. It was a system, a hidden ledger written into the very wood of frontier homes. Families traded, conspired, and erased their daughters with quiet efficiency, as if it were a currency. And Jonathan was not the lowest member of this circle. He was a gatekeeper, a man who provided, who collected, who kept the silence intact. For Eliza, the horror was double-edged. She was both victim and witness. She was being used, yet at the same time entrusted with fragments of truth, because they never imagined she could resist. They believed her too young, too fragile, too bound to Jonathan's will, but they underestimated her, because in her diary, beneath the visible words, she began leaving trails, hidden notes written in lemon juice, only visible when held to fire, maps sketched beneath innocent hymns, lists of names disguised as Bible verses. The men thought she was invisible, silent, powerless, but even then she was sharpening her weapon, the only one she had, her memory. Eliza had discovered the first truth. Jonathan was not a man acting out of madness. He was part of something older, something structured, something that reached beyond their isolated home, and she was determined to survive long enough to reveal it. The first time Eliza saw the ritual, she thought she was dreaming. She had grown used to the shadows moving through their cabin, the low voices muttering in the dark, the smell of wax and smoke that lingered on her husband's clothes. But this night was different. Jonathan woke her before moonrise, his grip cold on her wrist. He told her she was to watch and learn. She wanted to resist, but the force of his hand and the emptiness of the woods outside told her escape was impossible. He led her down into the earth. Beneath the cabin, hidden by a trapdoor she had never been allowed to open, was a root cellar that stretched deeper than any she had seen before. But it wasn't food that was stored there. The walls were carved with symbols, rough, jagged, burned into the beams with heated iron, circles within circles, triangles overlaid with crooked crosses. The men were waiting, 6 of them, their faces hidden by hoods cut from plain cloth, yet their boots and hands betrayed wealth, rings, buckles, fine stitching. These were not desperate farmers clinging to survival. They were men of means, men of standing. At the center of the room, a table stood covered in blackened cloth. Upon it lay objects Eliza would later describe in trembling detail: a lock of hair tied with twine, a small doll carved from bone, and a ledger, its pages marked with the same symbols she had begun decoding in her diary. Then came the chanting, low, droning, in a tongue she could not place, not English, not Latin, something older, guttural, designed to crawl beneath the skin rather than be understood. Eliza clutched her shawl, heart racing, as Jonathan forced her closer to the circle. "Look," he whispered, "and you will see what keeps us safe, what keeps the land ours." But what she saw was not safety. It was the sacrifice of innocence. They brought forth another girl, younger than Eliza, barefoot, trembling, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Eliza's diary records only fragments of what followed, her words breaking apart as if she could not bear to write them fully. The ash, the binding, the silence. But one phrase is clear, written over and over in the margins. They fed her to the circle. This was the truth Eliza had stumbled into, a network not only of secrecy, but of ritualized destruction, girls marked, chosen, erased, families complicit, men bound by blood and silence. And Eliza, though still a child herself, understood at that moment that she was no longer simply Jonathan's wife. She was property of the circle. Her survival would depend on playing their game, hiding her terror, and continuing her secret work, recording everything in the only weapon she had, her diary. What none of those men realized was that the girl they thought powerless was already building a record strong enough to outlive them all. After that night in the cellar, Eliza did not sleep for days. The chanting echoed in her head, the girl's scream seemed lodged in her bones, and every creak of the cabin felt like another footstep dragging her back underground. But worst of all was the silence that followed. Jonathan behaved as if nothing had happened. He chopped wood, fed the fire, spoke of planting and rain. The circle's work was never mentioned in daylight, as if the night had swallowed it whole. But Eliza knew better. She had seen enough to understand. The rituals were not isolated madness. They were the binding force of something larger, something that stretched its hands across families, land, and legacy. One evening she slipped from the cabin and made her way toward her family's homestead. She needed comfort, an anchor to the world she had once known. But when she reached the old house, she found her father speaking in low tones with 2 men she recognized from the cellar. Their hoods were gone, but their boots, their rings, they gave them away. Her father's face was grave, and though Eliza could not hear every word, one phrase cut through the air like a blade. "We keep the land only through the oath. Break it, and all is lost." Eliza froze, her blood turning to ice. It was not just Jonathan's secret, it was her family's too. She returned home shaken but determined. That night in her diary she began mapping the connections, names, symbols, fragments of overheard conversations. She drew the circles as she had seen them, marking the initials of men who stood within. She noted the strange ledger, its columns filled with dates and names of girls, some she knew, others she had never heard of. The pattern horrified her. Every year another name, another girl vanished into the silence. Some were daughters of poor families, others orphans whose disappearances were barely noticed, all marked, all fed to the circle. And yet, these men walked freely in town, respected and even revered. They gave sermons, signed land deeds, sat at the head of community gatherings. Their hands bore the stains of rituals that no one dared to speak of. Eliza's diary records her realization in one trembling line. This is no family curse. This is a covenant. For the first time, she understood the full scope of what she faced. She was not trapped only in a marriage or a cabin. She was ensnared in an unbroken chain of blood and silence that stretched generations deep. The question that began to gnaw at her was simple, yet terrifying. If the circle claimed girls every year to keep its hold, how long until her own name was written in that ledger? Eliza knew she could not bear the weight of the secret alone. Every night she looked at her diary, its pages filled with drawings and names, and feared what would happen if Jonathan, or worse the circle, ever discovered it. But she also knew that silence was the trap that kept the covenant alive. Someone beyond these woods had to know. So she began her first quiet rebellion. One morning, when Jonathan went out to barter in town, Eliza carefully tore a single page from her diary. On it she had copied the symbols carved into the cellar floor, along with 3 names, the minister, the magistrate, and a wealthy landowner who controlled nearly all of Brookhaven's farmland. She folded the page into a scrap no larger than a coin and hid it beneath her dress. Her hands shook as she made her way down the narrow dirt path that wound toward the river. There, at the edge of the water, stood a woman named Ruth, widowed, half-blind, and rumored to be touched by madness. Yet Ruth was the only soul in Brookhaven who had ever spoken aloud about disappearances. "The earth eats daughters," she muttered once at the market, and was laughed into silence. Eliza pressed the folded paper into Ruth's hands. "Keep this safe," she whispered. "If anything happens to me, show it to someone, anyone." Ruth's cloudy eyes widened, and she nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting her whole life for someone to hand her proof of what she already knew. But defiance never goes unseen for long. That night, as Eliza lay in bed, Jonathan's voice cut through the darkness. "You went walking today." His words were not a question. He leaned close, his breath heavy with suspicion. "Stay away from the river. There are eyes everywhere." Her blood ran cold. Had he seen her? Had someone followed? She forced herself into silence, but her heart pounded so loudly she feared he could hear it. When Jonathan finally turned away, Eliza realized something far more dangerous than discovery. The circle's power was not only in ritual, it was in surveillance, in the unseen eyes that seemed to watch her every step, tightening the noose of fear. Yet for the first time, she felt a sliver of hope. A single page of truth was now outside the circle's reach. Somewhere in Brookhaven, a secret waited to surface. But secrets, she was beginning to understand, always demanded a cost. The next evening, the house felt colder than usual, though no wind stirred outside. Jonathan sat at the table, sharpening a blade, his eyes never lifting to meet hers. The scraping sound of steel on stone filled the room like an accusation. Eliza tried to busy herself with mending, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "You think you're clever, don't you?" His tone was flat, but beneath it pulsed a threat. "Do you know what happens to wives who bring shame to their husbands? Do you know what happens when a woman forgets her place?" Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to deny, to play the obedient role, but his words struck too close to the truth. Someone had seen her by the river. Someone had told him. He set the blade down, slow and deliberate, and leaned forward, The circle protects its own, but it does not forgive betrayal. They are already asking questions about you, Eliza. They wonder if your silence can be trusted. Her breath caught. They know. Jonathan reached across the table and gripped her wrist, hard enough to leave marks. His smile was thin, almost tender, but it never touched his eyes. Do not test me. If you want to live, if you want to stay beneath this roof, you will keep your mouth shut. The circle sees more than you think. She pulled away, retreating to the safety of shadows, but the warning had carved itself into her. This was no longer suspicion, it was certainty. The circle's attention was fixed on her now. That night, as Jonathan slept, she pressed her palm against her wrist where his fingers had bruised her flesh. She felt like a bird caught in a snare, wings broken, the forest closing in around her. Yet deep inside, a spark refused to die. She thought of Ruth, clutching that torn page, and whispered a prayer that the secret would not vanish with her if the circle decided to silence her forever. The old women in Brookhaven used to say, "Once the circle turns its eyes upon you, there are only two paths, obedience or disappearance." Eliza knew she could not obey, and she feared that meant her days were numbered. The following morning, while Jonathan worked in the fields, Eliza wandered to the storage shed behind the house. It was a place he rarely entered, filled with broken tools, warped planks, and the smell of damp earth. She told herself she was looking for a basket, but in truth, she was searching for silence, space away from his watchful eyes. As she sifted through the clutter, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard. Something about it caught her attention. The wood was newer, lighter than the rest. With trembling fingers, she pried it free. Beneath it lay a small cloth bundle, wrapped tightly and bound with twine. Her breath quickened as she lifted it, the weight surprisingly heavy for its size. She unwrapped the fabric and gasped. Inside was a small leather journal, its cover worn but still intact. The initials pressed into it read, E.H. Eliza froze. The name struck her like a thunderclap. Emily Harper, one of the girls who had vanished 2 summers ago. Her fingers shook as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with hurried, uneven writing, pleas, warnings, fragments of prayers. But what chilled her most were the drawings, circles drawn again and again, with strange symbols carved inside them. Notes written in the margins. They meet at night by the ash tree. They said I must serve. The ones who refuse are taken. Eliza pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle a cry. Emily had been here, hiding this, trying to leave a trace. The realization sent shivers racing through her spine. The journal was not just a diary, it was evidence, proof that the circle's cruelty reached beyond whispered rumors. But as quickly as the fire of hope sparked, fear doused it. If Jonathan or anyone in the circle discovered she had found this, they would destroy her without hesitation. She clutched the journal to her chest, her pulse thundering in her ears. Outside he heard footsteps crunching on gravel. Jonathan's voice called her name, slow, measured, too close. Eliza shoved the journal back into the cloth, wrapped it tight, and slipped it beneath her dress. The floorboard groaned as she pressed it back into place. By the time Jonathan opened the shed door, she was holding a basket, her face composed, though her heart was screaming. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Eliza forced a smile. "Yes, just an old basket." But beneath the fabric against her skin, the truth pulsed like a heartbeat. Emily Harper's voice, reaching out from the grave, demanding to be heard. That night, after Jonathan fell into his usual heavy sleep, Eliza lay awake beside him, the journal hidden beneath her pillow. Each breath he took was a reminder of the risk she carried, yet the weight of Emily Harper's words pressed harder than fear. She waited, listening, until his snores deepened into rhythm. Only then did she slip from the bed, clutching a candle, and retreat to the farthest corner of the room. She opened the leather-bound book again, careful not to let the spine crack too loudly. The pages trembled in her hands, not from age, but from urgency. Emily had written as if she knew she was running out of time. The entries spoke of gatherings in the woods, rituals shrouded in secrecy. Emily described being led by torchlight to the ancient ash tree near the old mill, where townsfolk gathered in silence. Not just men but women too, faces veiled in shadows. The circle was larger than anyone dared believe. It was not a rumor confined to Brookhaven's elders. It was its lifeblood, its hidden law. Eliza's stomach turned as she read one passage. They chose Mary last. She cried for hours. They said she had to be purified. When she resisted, they dragged her into the clearing. We never saw her again. I fear I will be next. Her eyes burned as she traced the words with her fingertips. Mary, another girl from the list of the vanished. Their fates had not been chance, nor wandering, nor sickness. They had been taken. Further along, Emily's handwriting became jagged, frantic. She had begun sketching symbols, shapes within circles, spirals that bent inwards, strange marks that seemed older than language itself. Beneath one, Emily scrawled, "This is the mark of the covenant. They say it binds the bloodlines. I do not want to belong to them. God help me." Eliza closed the book, her hands trembling, her breath ragged. She understood now. This was not just cruelty. It was, as ritual, a system built on sacrifice and obedience. The girls weren't merely victims of men's lust or violence. They had been offerings, chosen to sustain something older and darker. The candle flickered, casting tall shadows on the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw faces in the flame, pale, watching, waiting. She slammed the journal shut and pressed it to her chest, forcing herself to breathe. Sleep would not come for her that night. For even in Jonathan's home, even in her own bed, Eliza knew the circle's reach was everywhere. She had uncovered the truth, and now the truth was hunting her. The following morning, Eliza walked through Brookhaven Square with the journal concealed beneath her shawl, her eyes scanning every familiar face with new suspicion. The market bustled as it always had, women trading eggs, men haggling over tools, but now every exchange seemed laced with quiet calculation. She wondered who among them had stood beneath the ash tree, who had chanted beneath the veil of torchlight. The journal's revelations gnawed at her. If Emily had been right, then half the town might be bound by this secret covenant. Eliza's task was no longer just survival, it was discernment. She had to know who could be trusted, if anyone at all. She tried first with Ruth Harper, Emily's aunt. The woman had grown frail, her eyes sunken since her niece vanished. Eliza approached her stall where she sold dried herbs, offering a soft smile. "You must miss Emily dearly," she said gently. Ruth's hand froze mid-measure. For a moment sorrow flickered across her face, but it was quickly smothered by fear. She leaned closer, voice lowered. "Hush, child. Do not speak her name here, not in daylight." Her fingers trembled as she pressed a bundle of sage into Eliza's palm, whispering, "Keep this. It wards away what lingers." Then, just as swiftly, she turned away, dismissing her as if nothing had been said. Eliza's heart pounded. That small exchange confirmed what she feared. Ruth knew, but fear bound her tongue. Later, she tested Jonathan's mother, a stern matriarch with a presence that filled every room she entered. At supper, Eliza mentioned Emily's name with feigned innocence, watching closely. The elder woman's knife paused mid-slice, her lips tightening into a thin line. Then she said only, "Emily Harper was a foolish girl who didn't know her place. Speak no more of her at my table." Eliza understood the warning. The circle's reach extended into her own household. That night she returned to her chamber and opened the journal again, but not to read. Instead, she studied the ink marks left behind by Emily's trembling hand. The symbols seemed to whisper in the dim candlelight, as though they were alive. She traced them with her fingertip, her mind racing. She had no allies she could name, not yet. But one truth settled heavily in her chest. Silence was the enemy. If the circle thrived on secrecy, then her weapon would have to be exposure. And yet, how does one expose a covenant when the very walls seem to listen, when even family tightens its grip to protect the lie? Eliza blew out the candle, clutching the journal tight, and whispered to herself in the dark, If I fall, then let someone find this. Let them know we were not mad. Let them know the truth was written. Eliza's decision was not made lightly. She knew the circle's power fed on silence, and if she could pry even a single crack into that wall, perhaps it would spread until the whole facade collapsed. Yet the risk was immense. The journal made it clear that those who broke the vow of secrecy were swiftly punished, their disappearances explained away with rehearsed lies. The following Sunday, as the town gathered in the modest wooden church, Eliza sat near the back, the journal hidden beneath her cloak. Reverend Alden preached in his usual monotone about obedience, patience, and God's will, a sermon more about keeping order than saving souls. But when the hymn began and voices filled the rafters, Eliza moved. Quietly, she slid a folded page torn from Emily's journal beneath the cracked hymnals on 3 different pews. On each page was one of Emily's scrawled sketches. The ash tree with its carved symbols, the circle of torchbearers, the markings etched into the earth. No explanations, only raw images that burned themselves into the mind. Her hands trembled as she worked, careful to appear as though she were only turning pages. By the time the hymn ended, her small rebellion was complete. She sang the final verse with her lips barely moving, her heart thundering like a war drum. The first sign that her act had not gone unnoticed came swiftly. As the congregation filed out, she saw Reverend Alden's eyes sweep the pews, lingering for a fraction too long on the places where she had left the pages. His expression never faltered, but his gaze found her, sharp as a blade, before drifting away as though nothing had happened. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Jonathan returned home with a strange look in his eyes. He did not speak at first, only removed his coat and sat heavily at the table. Then, after a long silence, he asked, "Eliza, have you been meddling in matters that do not concern you?" Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. He stared into the wooden grain of the table. "Things have been found, drawings, disturbances. Some in town say it is the work of children, but others believe someone is trying to stir what ought to stay buried." His tone carried no accusation, only warning. Yet beneath his words, Eliza felt the weight of the circle pressing down. They knew. They had felt the shift, and they would not let it go unanswered. That night, a stone struck her window as she lay in bed. When she dared to look, she saw no one, only the shadow of the ash tree swaying in the moonlight. But pinned to the stone with twine was a single message, scrawled in a hand she did not recognize. "Speak again, and you will join Emily." The threat pinned to her window did not silence Eliza. It ignited a fire inside her. Yet with each day that followed, the atmosphere of the town grew heavier, as though invisible hands were drawing tighter the strings of her life. The message was clear. She was no longer simply being observed. She was being marked. The change began subtly. When Eliza visited the market, conversations would stop as she passed. Neighbors she had known for years averted their eyes, speaking in hurried whispers once she was gone. Even the butcher, who had once greeted her warmly, now handed over her parcels with a stiffness that spoke more of fear than contempt. But the true shift came at home. Jonathan had always been quiet, a man taught to bear the burdens of tradition without question. Yet now his silence felt sharpened, deliberate. At supper, his gaze lingered on her too long, as if weighing her against some unseen measure. Once, when she reached for his hand, he pulled away, not with anger, but with a chilling detachment, as though he no longer trusted the woman he had married. One evening, as a storm broke over the valley, Eliza heard voices beneath her window. Cautiously she crept to the sill and peered into the rain. 3 men stood at the edge of the path, torches sputtering against the downpour. Though their faces were hidden in shadow, their presence was unmistakable. They were waiting, not for her to step outside, but to remind her that the circle's reach extended even into the sanctuary of her home. Sleep became a luxury. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the storm, every distant dog's bark felt like an omen. And still, the ash tree loomed, its branches scratching at the sky like blackened fingers. Sometimes she swore she could see shapes moving around it at night, figures that never quite stepped into the torchlight. Yet Eliza's greatest terror came not from Taz. He circles open intimidation, but from a discovery she made inside her own house. While cleaning Jonathan's study, she noticed a drawer slightly ajar. Inside lay a folded sheet of parchment, new, not aged, like Emily's journal. Her heart sank as she unfolded it. The page bore the same symbols Emily had sketched, but these were freshly inked, and beneath them, in a hand that she recognized as her husband's, was a single line of text. The oath must be preserved, even if blood is required. Her hands shook as she returned the parchment, careful to leave no trace. The realization struck her with cold certainty. Jonathan was no longer only her husband. He was a participant. The circle was no longer outside her walls. It was inside her home. The parchment burned in her memory, its words echoing with every breath she drew. The oath must be preserved, even if blood is required. The man she shared her life with, the man who had once held her with tenderness, was now bound to a vow older than their marriage, older than her very sense of safety. That night, she lay awake beside Jonathan, her body rigid as he slept soundly. Each rise and fall of his chest seemed like a cruel reminder. His heart still beat for her, but it also beat for something else, something darker. She tried to imagine his hand, the same hand that once traced soft circles on her back, drawing those symbols with precision and devotion. The thought made her shiver. Morning brought no relief. Jonathan greeted her as always, calm and measured, but his eyes no longer seemed fully his own. There was a distance in them, as if part of him lived in another world entirely. When he kissed her cheek before leaving for work, the gesture felt rehearsed, hollow, like a mask carefully put in place. Eliza wrestled with two choices. She could confront him, demand answers, force his silence into confession. But what if he turned on her? What if his loyalty to the circle outweighed his love for her? Or she could flee, abandoning her home, her marriage, and the life she had built in the valley. Yet running would mean admitting that the shadows had already won. Her turmoil deepened when she returned to the ash tree. She had to see it again, to ground herself in the madness. Beneath its blackened boughs, she noticed something new. The soil had been freshly disturbed, as though someone had been digging. She crouched low, brushing the earth aside with her trembling hands, until her fingers struck something solid. It was a stone, small and smooth, but carved with the same spiraling marks Emily had drawn in her journal. Clutching it to her chest, Eliza realized it weaponed. As not just a relic, it was a key, a token tied to the oath her husband now served. She did not yet know what door it unlocked, but she knew it was not meant for her hands. As the wind howled through the valley, she whispered aloud, her voice breaking, "Emily, what did you uncover, and why did it cost you everything?" Eliza rose with the stone still clutched tight. One truth had become undeniable. Her time for hesitation was gone. The circle was closing in. If she did nothing, she would share her sister's fate. The decision weighed on her like chains, but somewhere deep inside, a resolve began to harden. She would not be silenced. She would not be erased, even if it meant standing against her own husband. Eliza spread Emily's journal across the table, the edges worn and smudged with years of hidden grief. By candlelight she traced the sketches, spirals, interlocking circles, and figures that seemed half human, half shadow. At first they looked like the confused ramblings of a desperate mind, but then she noticed something. The drawings grew more precise as the pages turned, as if Emily had learned the language of the symbols over time. Her sister hadn't been losing her sanity, she had been recording something real. The further Eliza read, the more Emily's voice seemed to rise from the page, a desperate whisper echoing across the years. They promise safety, but it is only a bargain of blood. The tree is no symbol, it is the root of their binding. The oath feeds it, and it feeds them. Once you enter, you cannot leave. If they suspect doubt, you are already marked. Eliza shuddered. The ash tree was not simply a meeting place. It was a vessel, a living altar tied to the valley's oath. She thought of the fresh soil she had uncovered, the stone carved with spirals. It was part of a ritual, one Emily had discovered too late. Flipping further, she came upon a page nearly torn through with pressure from Emily's pen. The writing was jagged, frantic. The night of the harvest moon, they will gather. One must be offered, always one. A sacrifice to preserve the circle, to preserve the silence. Her heart stopped. A sacrifice. Suddenly, fragments of the past fell into place, those whispered rumors of neighbors who had vanished without explanation, the families that quietly moved away in grief, but never spoke aloud the reason. Eliza had dismissed them as tragedy, the cruelties of life in an unforgiving land. But now she knew they had been chosen, offered. She pressed her palm to her mouth, fighting the rising wave of nausea. Was this why Emily had died? Had her sister discovered too much, refused to participate, and paid with her life? And then came the darker thought, the one she could not push away. Was Jonathan's loyalty to the circle the only reason their marriage still stood? Had he chosen her to be spared? Or was her time simply not yet come? The candle sputtered, and shadows leapt across the room as if mocking her. Emily's final words on the page seared themselves into Eliza's mind. If you are reading this, beware. The sacrifice is not always the unwilling. Sometimes it is offered by the hand of one you love. Eliza slammed the journal shut, her chest heaving. The valley's silence was not born of fear. It was born of blood. The night pressed heavy against the farmhouse, the silence thick with something watching. Eliza could not shake the words from Emily's journal. Sometimes it is offered by the hand of one you love. They echoed in her skull, louder than the ticking of the clock, louder than the wind scratching against the shutters. Her mind turned, unwilling but unable to stop. The circle demanded sacrifice. Every harvest moon, every year without fail. That meant someone in the valley was chosen even now, perhaps already marked. But who decided? Who pointed the finger that sealed a neighbor's fate? Her gaze drifted to the chair by the hearth, Jonathan's pipe resting neatly beside it. His boots still carried the dust of the fields. He had spoken of loyalty, of tradition, of keeping peace with the land. At the time, it sounded like the words of a man bound to his heritage. Now it sounded like confession. Had Jonathan known all along? Had he smiled at her across the table while knowing her sister's death was not chance, but chosen? Eliza's hands trembled as she clutched the journal to her chest. She remembered the way he had insisted she not go to the ash tree, how his voice had hardened when she pressed him for answers. He hadn't been protecting her curiosity. He had been guarding the circle's secret. The harvest moon was only nights away. Her breath quickened. If the circle required one offering every year, then the question was no longer if someone would be taken, but who, and if Emily had once been the price. Could it now be her turn? Every flicker of Jonathan's smile, every touch of his hand now felt like a blade hidden beneath cloth. He had been distant, yes, but was it guilt that hollowed his voice, or was it calculation? Was he preparing her? She turned to the window, half expecting to see figures already gathering in the dark. The fields stretched silent beneath the stars. Yet the stillness carried weight, as though unseen eyes waited for her to understand her role. Eliza whispered into the night, though no one could hear her. I will not be their sacrifice. But as the wind shifted, carrying the faintest creak from the ash tree in the distance, a deeper truth clawed at her chest. In this valley, choice was an illusion. The circle had marked her the moment she married into its silence. And love, Jonathan's love, might be the very hand that delivered her. The night pressed heavy against the farmhouse, the silence thick with something watching. Eliza could not shake the words from Emily's journal. Sometimes it is offered by the hand of one you love. They echoed in her skull, louder than the ticking of the clock, louder than the wind scratching against the shutters. Her mind turned, unwilling but unable to stop. The circle demanded sacrifice. Every harvest moon, every year without fail. That meant someone in the valley was chosen even now, perhaps already marked. But who decided? Who pointed the finger that sealed a neighbor's fate? Her gaze drifted to the chair by the hearth, Jonathan's pipe resting neatly beside it. His boots still carried the dust of the fields. He had spoken of loyalty, of tradition, of keeping peace with the land. At the time, it sounded like the words of a man bound to his heritage. Now, it sounded like confession. Had Jonathan known all along? Had he smiled at her across the table while knowing her sister's death was not chance, but chosen? Eliza's hands trembled as she clutched the journal to her chest. She remembered the way he had insisted she not go to the ash tree, how his voice had hardened when she pressed him for answers. He hadn't been protecting her curiosity. He had been guarding the circle's secret. The harvest moon was only nights away. Her breath quickened. If the circle required one offering every year, then the question was no longer if someone would be taken, but who, and if Emily had once been the price. Could it now be her turn? Every flicker of Jonathan's smile, every touch of his hand now felt like a blade hidden beneath cloth. He had been distant, yes, but was it guilt that hollowed his voice, or was it calculation? Was he preparing her? She turned to the window, half expecting to see figures already gathering in the dark. The fields stretched silent beneath the stars. Yet the stillness carried weight, as though unseen eyes waited for her to understand her role. Eliza whispered into the night, though no one could hear her. "I will not be their sacrifice." But as the wind shifted, carrying the faintest creak from the ash tree in the distance, a deeper truth clawed at her chest. In this valley, choice was an illusion. The circle had marked her the moment she married into its silence, and love, Jonathan's love, might be the very hand that delivered her. Eliza had lived her life in quiet obedience, first to her father's stern commands, then to the customs of the village, and finally to Jonathan's steady, sometimes inscrutable ways. But as the days narrowed toward harvest, she felt a fire kindle in her that could not be smothered by fear. If Jonathan and the circle had marked her for sacrifice, then she would not go quietly. The decision was born in silence, in the still of the night when Jonathan's breathing told her he slept deeply. She rose, careful not to stir him, and moved to the chest her mother had left her, a battered thing of cedar and iron. Beneath the folded linens and forgotten trinkets, she found the small knife her mother once carried while tending the fields. The blade was worn but sharp enough to cut through twine or flesh if need demanded. Eliza wrapped it in cloth and hid it beneath her pillow. The next morning, Jonathan watched her closely, though he said nothing. His eyes lingered too long, searching, as if he could sense her change. Eliza forced a smile, her hands steady as she poured his coffee, her voice calm as she spoke of the weather. Inside, though, her mind raced with plans. She began to listen differently. When the neighbors spoke in hushed tones by the well, she lingered within earshot. She heard mentions of the chosen night, of blood for bounty, of the binding circle. Their words stitched together the truth she had feared. The festival was not mere celebration, it was ritual, and she was to be its heart. Eliza did not weep. She did not plead. Instead, she remembered her mother's warnings, half-mad mutterings that the women of their line carried something the circle feared. She did not yet know what that meant, but she clung to it like a rope in the dark. At dusk, she walked alone into the fields, ignoring Jonathan's protests. The stalks of corn rose around her, whispering in the wind, and she pressed her palms against the soil. It thrummed faintly beneath her touch, as though something ancient and restless stirred beneath the roots. She whispered a prayer, not to the god the village claimed, but to her mother, to her blood, to whatever power had guarded her family before the circle's reach. That night, as Jonathan lay beside her, Eliza kept her eyes open. Sleep would not come. The knife was hidden, her resolve unshaken. She had been chosen as the offering, but she had chosen to fight. The festival day dawned with a cruel brightness. The sun spilled over Ashford Hollow as though blessing what was about to unfold, yet the air was heavy, stifling, as if even the heavens wished to turn away. The townsfolk busied themselves with garlands of dried corn husks, with candles carved from thick tallow, with chants disguised as songs of thanksgiving. To any traveler passing through, it might have seemed a harvest celebration, but to Eliza, every detail felt sharpened into menace. Jonathan dressed her carefully, his hands steady though his eyes betrayed unease. He tied the laces of her bodice with an almost ceremonial care, then kissed her forehead without speaking. She could feel the weight of his silence, as though he were already mourning her. The villagers gathered as the sun dipped low, carrying torches that painted the fields in swaying light. Children skipped and laughed, but their parents' faces were grim. Every eye that brushed over Eliza seemed to linger too long. She felt exposed, marked, as though some unspoken brand had been burned into her skin. The procession moved toward the old grove beyond the cornfields. Eliza walked among them, her knife hidden beneath the folds of her dress, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. Jonathan walked close but did not reach for her hand. He had surrendered her to them, and in that surrender, he revealed the depth of his fear. The grove loomed ahead, its trees twisted and blackened as though lightning had struck them again and again. At its center lay a ring of stones, worn smooth by countless feet and countless rituals. Candles flickered in the grass, their flames bending unnaturally as though pulled toward the center of the circle. The leader of the circle, an elder with eyes like pale glass, lifted his arms. His voice carried over the crowd, low and resonant. Blood for the earth, breath for the harvest, flesh for the covenant. The villagers murmured the words in reply, a chorus of submission. Eliza's knees weakened, but she did not falter. She could feel the knife against her thigh, its presence a steady reminder. She would not bow. As they ushered her into the ring, the elder's eyes met hers. There was recognition there, fear even, and in that brief flicker, Eliza understood. She was not simply prey. She was something the circle had sought to suppress, something older than their chance, something her blood still carried. The air shifted. The ritual was about to begin, and Eliza for the first time felt the power stirring within her veins. The circle closed around her, torches raised high, their light searing the night like 1,000 watchful eyes. The elder's voice rose above the murmurs, weaving words in a language that Eliza did not know, yet felt vibrating in her bones. Each syllable seemed to claw at her skin, dragging her closer to something ancient and merciless. The villagers swayed in rhythm, their voices building into a single pulsing chant. The sound pressed against her skull until she could hardly breathe. Jonathan stood at the edge of the circle, his fists clenched, his face hollowed with helplessness. He looked at her not as a husband, but as a man already resigned to her absence. Eliza's hands trembled, but not from fear. The knife beneath her dress grew warm, as though it had been waiting for this moment, as though it recognized the words that filled the air. She could feel something stirring inside her, rising like a tide against the chains of the chant. The elder approached her, carrying a vessel carved of stone. Within it, a dark liquid shimmered in the torchlight, thick, metallic, alive. He dipped his fingers into it and traced a line across her forehead. The mark burned, but the pain was not her own. It felt as if the land itself was trying to claim her. The chanting quickened. The air grew heavy. Torches flickered as though oxygen itself had thinned. The elder raised the vessel high and cried out, "The offering comes. Let the covenant be renewed." Eliza's heart pounded, each beat louder than the chant. For a moment she saw flashes, visions that did not belong to her, women in centuries past bound in this same circle, their eyes filled with defiance, their screams drowned by ritual. She saw her own mother, young and terrified, pulled into the same fate. The lineage of sacrifice stretched back farther than memory. But then another vision split through, a hand breaking the cirque. Lee, blood-staining stone, fire erupting from within. A woman, not defeated but triumphant. The vision seared itself into her mind, a reminder that she did not have to kneel, that the covenant could be broken. Her fingers brushed the knife, its blade hummed softly, hungry. The elder leaned closer, whispering words only she could hear. "You were never meant to escape. You carry the curse. Tonight, it will end in you." Something inside her snapped. The fear that had weighed her down turned to steel. She realized she had a choice, not only to strike, but to awaken what the circle had buried for generations. The chant thundered, the knife burned in her hand, and Eliza, standing at the center of the stones, knew the ritual would not unfold as the circle intended. The air quivered as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Every torch cast shadows that twisted like living things, clawing across the stone circle. Eliza's fingers wrapped tight around the knife, its hilt hot, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her racing heart. The elder lifted the vessel again, his voice booming like thunder. "The covenant is eternal. The bloodline must pay." The villagers echoed him, their chants surging like a tidal wave, pressing in on her from all sides. Eliza's knees weakened, but she refused to bow. She had seen the truth in those visions, generations silenced, women broken, their screams buried beneath ritual and stone. She would not be the next name swallowed by the earth. With one sharp motion, she pulled the knife free from beneath her dress. Gasps tore through the circle, the chant stumbling for the first time. The blade shimmered in the firelight, not dull steel but something alive, whispering with a voice only she could hear. "End it." The elder snarled, his composure cracking. "Foolish child, do you think one blade can undo centuries?" He raised the vessel as if to strike her with it, but Eliza moved first. She drew the knife across her palm, blood spilling onto the ground. The earth groaned. The circle shuddered. A deep vibration ripped through the stones beneath her feet, as if the land had awakened and recognized its true heir. The villagers screamed. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads as if her defiance was splitting them open from within. Jonathan lunged forward, but the invisible wall of the circle threw him back. His cry, her name, torn from his throat, echoed against the roar of the ritual unraveling. Eliza lifted her bleeding hand high. "No more!" Her voice, raw and unyielding, cut through the chaos. "Your covenant dies tonight." The torches flickered violently, then extinguished all at once. Darkness wallowed the circle, but her blood glowed faintly against the knife, crimson light spreading like cracks in a dying world. The elder stumbled back, fear widening his eyes. For the first time, his authority faltered. "You don't understand what you've done," he hissed. But Eliza did. She felt it burning in her veins, ancient power unchained, no longer bound by their chants or stones. The curse had not ended in her, it had awakened through her. The circle was broken, the covenant shattered, and the night itself seemed to tremble, waiting to see what she would become. The silence after the collapse was not peace, it was terror. The chants had stopped, but what replaced them was worse, the sound of 100 voices screaming at once. Villagers staggered backward, their eyes wide, their mouths foaming as if something had been torn out of them. Some clawed at the earth, others at their own skin, as though the covenant that once bound them now gnawed from the inside out. Jonathan stumbled to his feet and forced his way toward her, his eyes filled with both fear and awe. The barrier was gone. The circle, once impenetrable, had cracked like shattered glass. He reached her side just as her knees nearly buckled. Her hand still bled, the glow fading, but the knife pulsed brighter than ever, its whisper growing louder, demanding more. "Eliza," Jonathan's voice broke. "What did you do?" "I ended it," she said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. The words were brave, but inside her chest burned the truth. She had not ended anything. She had unleashed it. The elder writhed on the ground, his authority stripped bare. His robes were torn, his face pale, but still he spat defiance. "You think yourself free. You are not the destroyer of the covenant. You are its vessel." His words struck deeper than any blade. Eliza froze. Vessel, not savior, not liberator, a continuation of everything she had tried to escape. Around them, the villagers convulsed as shadows spilled from their mouths, writhing into the night like smoke. The shapes were not human, elongated limbs, twisted wings, faces stretched into eternal screams. They rose above the circle, blotting out the moon, as if centuries of stolen voices had been vomited back into the world. Jonathan grabbed her hand, his grip fierce. "We need to run." But she didn't move. She couldn't. The shadows weren't attacking her. They bent toward her instead, drawn to her blood, her body, her breath, as though she was the center of their gravity. Their whispers drowned out Jonathan's voice, weaving around her mind like chains. You broke the seal. Now you are the seal. Her heart pounded so hard it shook her chest. Her body trembled. She realized then that the elder was right. The curse had not been destroyed. It had simply changed shape, shifted its anchor. And that anchor was her. The weight of it hit her like iron shackles. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, as though her lungs no longer belonged to her. Every shadow rising from the villagers turned toward her, their forms bending and warping in worship or hunger. They didn't scatter into the night. They spiraled, tightening, orbiting her, as if she were their star, their anchor, their prison. Jonathan shook her shoulders, desperation in his eyes. Eliza, listen to me, we can still escape. Whatever this is, we'll fight it together. But she knew the truth. His words were kind, human, naive. She could feel it deep in her blood. There would be no escape. The shadows hissed in unison, their voices like 100 serpents slithering inside her skull. You broke the covenant. Now you wear it. Now you hold it. Now you feed us. Her hand clenched around the dagger. It throbbed as if alive, its whispers now echoing her own thoughts. The curse wasn't asking her for choice. It was offering her two dooms. Bind them inside herself or let them consume everything else. She saw it clearly. If she rejected them, the shadows would flood outward, swallowing the valley, the village, perhaps the world. If she accepted them, if she became the vessel, they would cage themselves in her flesh, but at a cost that no soul could bear. The elder laughed from the dirt, his voice cracked but triumphant. You think you ended us? No, you are us now. You are the covenant's final form. Your suffering will be the seal that keeps the rest safe. That is the design. Tears burned in her eyes, not from weakness but from rage. Rage at the lies, the manipulation, the centuries of bondage that had all led to this moment. They had planned it. She had not broken their system. She had fulfilled it. Jonathan's voice broke through the storm of whispers. Don't listen to him. You're not their vessel. You're stronger than this. But, as she turned to him, she saw her reflection in his eyes, and it froze her blood. Her face flickered with something inhuman, her shadow stretching long and twisted against the stones. The curse had already begun carving its place inside her. The night trembled as the shadows pressed closer, brushing against her skin like cold hands. They weren't attacking, they were waiting for her answer. And in that silence, Eliza understood the horror. The choice was not whether to bind them. The choice was how much of herself she was willing to lose in order to keep the world safe. The wind died. The torches guttered out. Even the night seemed to wait for her decision. Eliza's hands shook around the dagger. Her heart begged her to throw it down, to run, to cling to Jonathan's arms and choose a life free from this curse. But somewhere beneath that fragile human instinct, she felt the rhythm of something older, darker, and far less forgiving. The curse was not a storm she could outlast. It was the ground she stood on, the air she breathed, the blood in her veins. Jonathan gripped her shoulders, his voice raw. Eliza, please, don't do this. We'll find another way. We always do. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to, but as she looked at him, his face full of hope, his body trembling, his soul uncorrupted, she knew the truth he couldn't bear to see. If she refused, the shadows would pour outward, beyond this valley, beyond these hills, until every innocent face in the world wore the same twisted expression as the elders. Someone had to carry it. Her voice came out hollow, almost unrecognizable. There is no other way. I have to take them. I have to be the one. Jonathan's eyes widened in horror. No, Eliza, no! The shadows surged, wrapping around her like chains of ice. The dagger blazed with black fire, its whispers turning into a chorus that shattered the air. She pressed it against her chest, not to end her life, but to open herself as a vessel. Agony tore through her, every bone and vein burning as the curse sank deeper. She felt her soul splitting, her humanity peeling away in strips, replaced by something vast, something eternal, something that should never exist in flesh. The shadows screamed as they entered her, each one clawing, devouring, binding itself to her being. Jonathan tried to hold her, but the force threw him back. He screamed her name, his voice breaking against the storm, but she could no longer answer. When it endeared, the silence was worse than the screams. Eliza stood trembling, her eyes blackened, her veins glowing faintly with an unholy light. The shadows were gone from the earth. They were inside her now, bound, contained, caged. The elder lay lifeless on the ground, his work complete. The village was safe. The curse was sealed. But Eliza was no longer Eliza. Jonathan rose, tears streaking his face. He took one step toward her, but stopped when she lifted her gaze. Her eyes were endless voids, bottomless, yet shimmering with the faint memory of who she had been. Her lips parted, her voice layered with echoes not her own. Run, while I can still tell you to. He hesitated, choking on grief. I won't leave you. Her scream shook the valley, a sound of pain and command entwined. Run! And Jonathan ran, his sobs carrying into the night. Eliza stood alone on the blood-soaked stones, the covenant complete. She was both prison and prisoner, savior and sacrifice, and as the moon broke through the clouds, her shadow stretched across the ground, longer, darker, and no longer her own. The world was safe, but Eliza Whitlow had been erased, replaced by the curse she had sworn to destroy. The covenant had won. The valley was quiet, but the quiet was a lie. Every tree, every rock, every whispering wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself knew what had happened and feared it. Eliza moved among the remnants of the circle, her steps precise, measured, and terrifyingly deliberate. Each footfall pressed the curse deeper into the soil, binding the shadows she had contained to the very earth beneath her feet. Jonathan had vanished beyond the tree line, swallowed by the night and his own fear. He would tell no one what he had seen, could tell no one. Even if he tried, the words would crumble on his tongue, inadequate to describe the girl who had become a vessel, a living prison for ancient horrors. Eliza's breath came in slow, controlled rhythms. Inside her, the whispers had not stopped. They had grown quieter, disciplined, almost obedient. She could feel them moving beneath her skin, a network of darkness that was hers to command. And yet she also felt the weight of every life that had been lost to the covenant, every scream that had been fed into her, every soul that had been chained to her existence. She knelt beside the elder's lifeless form, and the memories of the ritual burned into her mind. She saw the villagers, their faces twisted in terror, their cries extinguished by her choice. She saw Jonathan's despair, his helplessness as she became more than human, and she saw herself, not the girl who had stepped into the circle, trembling with fear, but the entity she had become. Guardian, jailer, weapon, and curse all at once. Her hands hovered over the dagger, now dim but still pulsing faintly with black fire. It had been the conduit, the spark that allowed her to contain what was once free. But the knife was no longer necessary. The curse had learned her voice, her heartbeat, her thoughts. She could summon it, command it, or let it slumber, patient and eternal. Above the trees, the moon pierced the clouds, casting silver light over the valley. For a moment, Eliza allowed herself to imagine freedom, humanity, what life could have been. And then she remembered the cost. Freedom for her would have meant the death of thousands, the unraveling of the world she now protected. Her lips curved in a grim smile. She was alone, yes, but she was powerful. The covenant was complete, and as she rose, shadows clinging to her like loyal servants, she whispered into the night, "This world will never know what walks among it, until it's too late." Night fell thicker now, a velvet curtain pierced only by distant stars. Eliza moved through the valley with a silence that belonged to shadows, her feet making no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. The villagers had fled, or had they? She didn't need them to see her to know that every home, every hidden corner was marked in her awareness. The covenant had given her senses the memory of centuries, of pain and deceit, of secrets buried and truths denied. Every flicker of movement, every whisper of wind was catalogued. She felt the lingering fear of the villagers, as though it were a pulse beneath her fingertips, their terror now her tool, her reminder of what had been saved and what had been lost. The world was safe, yes, but it had been purchased with a price so high that her humanity hung by a thread. She climbed the ridge overlooking the village. Lights glimmered from the cottages, small points of warmth against the dark. She could feel the heartbeat of each home, the hope, the love, the fragile illusions of safety. They were naive, they were ignorant, and yet they lived because she bore the curse, because she had chosen the vessel over chaos. Her shadow stretched across the land, no longer her own. It moved with a life independent of her body, creeping along the valley floor like a predator. She whispered into it, and the shadows obeyed, circling the village, touching the forest, slithering into hidden places. All the secrets, all the sins buried in the soil, trembled before her. Jonathan had survived, she knew. She could feel his heartbeat from the ridge where he had hidden, trembling, fearing that she might hunt him, but she did not move toward him. She had become more than a girl scorned, more than a frightened child. She was a guardian, a sentinel, and a warning. She was the living consequence of the covenant, and the covenant was eternal. Her lips parted, voice low, almost lost in the wind. "I am here, and I am waiting. Do not forget what you cannot see, for what you cannot see can destroy you faster than anything you can imagine." In that moment, the valley was hers alone. The night bowed to her, and even the moonlight seemed hesitant to touch the ground where she walked. She was no longer just Eliza Whitlow. She was the covenant incarnate, a living reminder that the price of safety is the surrender of one's soul. And the shadows whispered back in reverent harmony, following her, ready, patient, eternal. The valley slept beneath her gaze, yet Eliza knew the world beyond stirred, unaware of the web she now guarded. The covenant's whispers reached further than her eyes could see, brushing against distant towns, trailing over rivers, slipping into forests untouched by man. What had been contained in one valley now pressed against the edges of reality, testing limits, probing weaknesses. She climbed higher, atop the jagged cliffs that overlooked the darkened expanse of land. From there she could sense the currents of human ambition, greed and folly, each one a thread connected to the shadows she bore. The curse, though bound, was not inert. It was alive, whispering possibilities, hinting at danger, reminding her that vigilance must be eternal. A faint light flickered miles away in a small trading town. She felt the heat of human conflict there, the hidden malice, the secret betrayals. A child lied to save face. A merchant cheated his neighbor. A man plotted a murder under candlelight. None of it mattered to them. They were blind. But she saw. She always saw, and the shadows followed her command, reaching subtly enough that the world remained ignorant but balanced precariously on the edge of her will. Jonathan had once been the tether to her humanity. She could feel him now, distant and fearful, clinging to normalcy, praying the nightmare had ended with the valley. He did not know that the nightmare had only expanded, that the covenant would follow him, follow everyone. She did not wish him harm, at least not yet, but she understood that the moment someone sought to disrupt the balance, the curse could strike faster than light, more precise than thought. Her body pulsed with the knowledge of what she carried: power, darkness, life and death intertwined. The valley was safe because she had given herself wholly to the covenant. And yet, the world beyond, the unsuspecting, unprepared world, remained a tinderbox. One spark of human folly, one act of malice could awaken the shadows she had contained, releasing them like wildfire. Eliza exhaled slowly. Her voice, low and commanding, whispered into the night. The world does not know. It does not see, and it cannot comprehend. But I will ensure that ignorance endures until it is forced to pay. The shadows responded, flowing from her like living ink across the landscape, touching forests, rivers and villages, bending the unseen fabric of reality to her vigilance. She was alone, yes, but she was never truly alone. The covenant was eternal, and so was she. Far beyond the valley, in the dim light of a distant town, a presence stirred, one that did not belong to the ordinary world. Eliza felt it first as a ripple, a faint disturbance in the shadows she had bound within herself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight she could not ignore. Something ancient, something cunning was probing, testing, waiting. She closed her eyes, letting the currents of the covenant flow through her senses. Her heartbeat slowed, her awareness stretching across miles of land, threading through forests, rivers, and human dwellings. The presence was deliberate, it moved with intent, it knew the covenant existed, and it hungered for it. A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear but from recognition. The shadows whispered warnings, their voices layered in urgency. Not all who wander are lost, not all who seek are blind. There is one who understands, one who can unravel what you have woven. Eliza opened her eyes. The night seemed to hold its breath, the stars dimmed, and even the wind seemed cautious. She understood then that her control, as absolute as it felt, was not infinite. There were forces beyond her knowledge, beyond the valley, capable of challenging the very covenant she carried. Forces that could strike from distances she could not see, from angles she could not predict. Jonathan's faint heartbeat reached her. He was still alive, still clinging to hope, still unknowing of the magnitude of what she had become. She wanted to warn him, to protect him, but the shadows murmured a stark truth. Some knowledge, once revealed, cannot be contained. The threat beyond the valley must be confronted alone, and she must prepare. Her hands rose, tracing patterns in the air that only she could perceive. The shadows responded instantly, coiling around her limbs, her spine, her mind, ready to obey, ready to defend. She had been the hunted. She had been the victim. But now she was the sentinel, the weapon, the fortress. Yet even as the shadows bent to her will, the presence grew bolder. A faint echo of movement, a cold pulse against her consciousness, told her that this was no ordinary challenge. This was something deliberate, calculating, ancient, an entity capable of testing the covenant itself. Eliza's lips curved in a grim smile. So it comes. Let it come. Let it feel what it means to confront eternity itself. The night trembled, the valley held its breath, and somewhere beyond the darkness, the first move of the unseen adversary began. The night was thick, almost suffocating, as the presence drew closer. Eliza could feel it pressing against the edges of her consciousness, testing the limits of the covenant she bore. The shadows quivered at the intrusion, coiling tighter around her, a living armor of darkness. She inhaled, steady, precise. This was the moment the valley had feared, the moment the world could never know had arrived. The entity emerged from the darkness, not a figure, not a creature, but a pulse of thought, intelligence beyond flesh, a malice older than any human history. It whispered, not in words but in understanding, a cold knowing that slithered into her mind. I have come for what you contain, for the power you have stolen from the night itself. Eliza's eyes flared with black fire. The shadows surged, spinning around her in a vortex of living darkness. She did not hesitate. The covenant was hers, and it would not be taken. Her voice, layered with the chorus of the bound shadows, rang out, You will not touch what I protect. I am the sentinel. I am the cage. I am the curse. The pulse attacked, a force of pure thought, but the shadows struck back, tearing at it with every ounce of her will. Reality itself seemed to fracture around them. Trees shuddered, the wind howled, and the valley trembled under the weight of ancient power unleashed. Jonathan's voice, distant, called her name, but she did not answer. There was no room for fear, no room for hesitation, only the covenant, the shadows, and the battle for dominion over a force far older than mankind itself. Hours, or was it minutes, passed in silence, broken only by the clash of unearthly wills. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the presence recoiled, retreating into the darkness, leaving behind a stillness so profound it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. The covenant remained unbroken. The valley remained Eliza stood alone, her body trembling, her soul forever altered. She was no longer a girl who had walked into a cursed circle. She was its master, its jailer, its living embodiment. The shadows whispered their allegiance, echoing through the valley like a warning. We obey, we endure, we are eternal. Jonathan found her at dawn, his eyes wide with disbelief, his relief mixed with terror. She looked at him, and for the first time, allowed a fragment of the girl she had once been to surface. "The world will never know," she said, voice both gentle and impossibly commanding, "and that is how it must remain. Some truths are too dangerous to see, some powers too heavy to bear." The valley was quiet again, but it would never truly be silent. Eliza Whitlow, the girl who had become a curse to save the world, remained its shadowed guardian, an eternal sentinel walking the thin line between salvation and annihilation. And somewhere in the darkness beyond, the whisper of ancient forces lingered, waiting, watching, remembering.